I do believe that even people or institutions with the best intentions will make a situation worse when you allow them to censor content. But returning to the other part of your question about why do I think it's prevalent now, an interesting thing has happened in the digital era, and the digital era occurred while we were already in a very hyper-polarized time. Starting with Reagan, we didn't talk about the other side in terms of, hey, I disagree with your policies. We talked about the other side of, you're going to destroy my way of life, right? This was Reagan's message. Liberals are destroying the country, and liberals took that up to say the same about Republicans. And in the age of big tech, and particularly Web 2.0 and social media, we were allowed to customize what we saw, who we engaged with. We were able to block who we didn't want to hear. And I think it's been really toxic for the culture.
Welcome to Endless Coffee Cup, a regular discussion of marketing news, culture, and media for our complex digital lifestyle. Join Matt Bailey as he engages in conversation to find insights beyond the latest headlines and deeper understanding for those involved in marketing. Grab a cup of coffee, have a seat, and thanks for joining.
Well, hello and welcome to another edition of the Endless Coffee Cup podcast. As always, I'm your host, Matt Bailey, and bringing you digital marketing education and what's involved in this incredible industry. Now, those of you that have been longtime listeners, you will know our next guest. He has been with us numerous times. And in fact, Nolan, I think you and one other are tied for the most appearances on the Endless Coffee Cup. So please welcome Nolan Higdon. Nolan, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me back on. It's been way too long, and I want to know the name of this person who is challenging me for supremacy as a guest on this program.
Yeah, we could have a little battle royal afterwards. I think that would be a lot of fun. That could be great. But I noticed, so we've been going back and forth, and we, I love reading your Substack, and I'll give you some feedback off of that. But one of the things I noticed on your latest email to me is there is a doctor in front of your name, and congratulations on that.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Hey, anyone who goes through that and subjects themselves to, that amount of scrutiny and work, it's a congratulations in order.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
But you are, for those that are new to the podcast, Nolan is a professor of history, media studies, and education. But usually we have talked about media studies. You've been involved with a number of books, and that is a lot of what you write about as well. Could you just tell us a little bit about, what got you into studying media, journalism, and then how that has worked out in the books that you've written, and maybe highlight a couple of titles for us?
For sure. Ever since I was a young child, I was really interested in history. And my grandparents, who were married and still alive, came from Ireland. And they used to just entertain me with stories about World War II, what it was like being there and what they did. And so I got this interest in history that was piqued by a bunch of great teachers I had. But around the time I got to college, I wanted to study history, but I was really, obsessed with the lies around WMDs that got the United States into the Iraq War. And I had a great history professor who talked to me about, the history of lies of getting people into war. So I want to study that, but I also want to study news media's role in it. But I realized I needed to know more about news media. So that kind of took me down the media studies path. And then I was looking at these fields of, how do you prepare a population so they don't fall for media lies like they did in WMDs? And that's when I came across the field of media literacy. And to understand what media literacy was and how it fit in the larger frame of the United States, I had to study education and understand that. And so I just sort of, bounced from one topic to the other. I've always seen how they intersect, but it was, just kind of curiosity really piqued my interest in the three. And, to this day, I mix all three into the things I write. So, followers of my Substack, some sign up because they're interested in media, some because education, some history, but they get all of the above and, really add a historical framework to everything I think about. So I'm the annoying guy when someone says, oh, who could have predicted this would happen? I'll be like, well, actually that happened in 1819 and I'm that guy.
Oh, I love it. That's great. That's great. Yeah, there's always there's always a foundation for something, and when you know the history of it, and so I think that's a valuable trifecta. But you've been involved in I don't know how many book projects. I've got a few on my shelf, but those of you on video, if you're looking behind Nolan, there is a plethora of publications behind him.
Yeah, do a lot of writing. Do individual work, but I also like collaborative work. I just really like researching and writing. It's always very fun.
Hmm. Well, and one of the things I absolutely love, and I, and through our conversations, I think once you said something like, you're kind of hard to peg, and I felt like it was kind of the same with you that, like, what I love about your writing is you're not falling into a traditional political category, and I think anyone who is really focused on media literacy and media education, I'm finding that the more people I meet like that, the less the less easy or the the more difficult it is to realize you just can't peg someone that, oh, you're a progressive, you're a Republican, you're this or that, because there seems to be a much wider understanding of issues, but also realizing very few people are single issue type people, that there's an incredible variation of what people believe, why they believe it, and I might feel this way on this issue, but I'm opposite on this issue, that you just can't pigeonhole people. And that's one of the things I've loved about, you and some of the organizations you're with, and how you've been writing is you definitely have like anyone, we all have bias, but you really speak to both sides of things and work through that and help people to understand how to see that.
Absolutely. Yeah, like anybody else, I have, strong political views on policies and individuals and things like that. But the thing I always think about, and I know you and I have talked about this both off air and on air, and I think this is a reason why we've been able to collaborate all these years. If you're guided by principles, I think that transcends party.
Mm.
So I have a principle to truth. So I call out lies where I see them, even when it's the folks I wish were in office, or it's related to the policies I wish were passed. I just my principle is truth. My principle is anti-censorship. My principle is free speech. So that means sometimes I stand up for people I disagree with. I was just watching a documentary last night on Alex Jones, who is, in an awkward way, hugely responsible for launching a lot of my writing career. That was the first major piece I wrote, was taking down Jones. And this is about 10 years ago. But when he was, when there were threats of censoring him online, I was one of his biggest defenders, even though I
Mm.
think he's, a complete liar and fraud. I just said, no, my principle is to free speech and anti-censorship. And regardless of who the target is, I won't stand by it. And so I think what I try and advocate for people is just maintain those principles regardless of the party. And then it becomes a lot easier to understand the world. You're not trying to defend a side you can't defend because the evidence isn't there. Instead, you just defend truth where you see it, and defend other principles that you value.
I love that, and if you don't mind, I want to dig a little bit into that, Nolan, because it's one of the things, and I keep seeing surveys, I keep seeing interviews, and it seems like less people agree with free speech now than maybe 20 or even 40 years ago. Why is free speech such kind of a two-pronged question? Why is free speech such a important issue, and why is this valuable? Why is it so distinguished in our culture?
Yeah, I mean, I think free speech. I really believe in the exchange of ideas, and even though I teach in higher ed, I know we're going to talk about higher ed in a minute. I'm not a higher ed absolutist. I tend to think that you talk to the average voter, they may not be able to articulate in scholarly language the reality of what's going on in the world, but voters typically get it. They typically have an experience. So they typically understand the world in some deep, meaningful way. So when we suppress speech, we lose an opportunity to share those ideas, to find that community, to find that connection. And there's a lot of problems with censorship. And one of the big ones, and I think this is one of the things a lot of folks are facing right now, in particular, I think the left has gotten bitten by this one. It's easy to make a list of things we wish we didn't have in the culture. Like, I wish there wasn't hate speech. I wish there wasn't racism. I wish there wasn't sexism. If I could wave a magic wand, I would get rid of them right away. But the deeper question, and this is the one that people need to wrestle with, is who do you trust to get rid of those speeches? Who are you going to empower to monitor and moderate speech? And who do you trust to only get rid of those things if they promise to and nothing else? And I think that is a more pivotal question that I would pose to these people who are advocating for censorship. So, you'll hear from the right about, national security issues. That's why we have to censor content or maintain the stability of society. And you'll hear from the left how we never had free speech, and that marginalized communities have never been protected under free speech. And there's valid reasons to support all of those arguments, but I still think they come back to the idea of, like, who do you trust? If you're an anti-racist, do you really trust the United States government to be an anti-racist institution? I mean, I don't want to spend the rest of this podcast going through its history, but counting Black people as 3/5 of a person, Japanese internment, Flint water crisis, you go down the list here of historical events. I wouldn't trust government. Ditto for industry. We find a lot of, in big tech, for example, a lot of algorithmic bias, particularly racist bias in algorithms. Do you trust them? And then we have all the cases of where, once government or big tech has been allowed to censor, they've censored content that's threatened their power or threatened their profit motive, not necessarily things that are bad for the culture. So for all those reasons, I am a free speech absolutist. I do believe the good ideas win at the end of the day. When you have free speech, I do believe that even people or institutions with the best intentions will make a situation worse when you allow them to censor content. But returning to the other part of your question about why do I think it's prevalent now, an interesting thing has happened in the digital era. And the digital era occurred while we were already in a very hyper-polarized time. Starting with Reagan, we didn't talk about the other side in terms of, hey, I disagree with your policies. We talked about the other side of, you're going to destroy my way of life, right? This was Reagan's message. Liberals are destroying the country. And liberals took that up to say the same about Republicans. And in the age of big tech, and particularly Web 2.0 and social media, we were allowed to customize what we saw, who we engaged with. We were able to block who we didn't want to hear. And I think it's been really toxic for the culture. Yeah. You hear a lot of people talk about white fragility, right? That white people lack the stamina to talk about race. I think that most of the country lacks the stamina to just hear that they're wrong or things they disagree with. Like, they just don't have it anymore. And I think the digital era is, highly responsible for that. And so I think a lot of people are looking for quick fixes. Like, why can't we just kick all the white supremacists off social media? Why can't we get rid of hate speech? And that sounds easy on the surface, but this is where I say it came back to bite the left. I think a lot of these Gaza protesters were the very same people who probably advocated for that type of censorship, and now they find themselves the victim of censorship themselves. A very powerful lobby is suppressing their free speech and their rights. And this is sort of what they advocated for against another side over the last 10 years. So it's a very messy situation in that sense.
Hey everyone, this is Matt, and thanks for listening. Just a quick break in the middle of the podcast here to let you know there's a couple ways that you can connect with us. The first is learn.sitelogic.com. That's the learning site where you can see courses on analytics, courses on digital marketing across paid search, SEO, multiple disciplines. And then also, you can connect with us on Slack. Go to Slack if you're there and look for us at endlesscoffeecup.slack.com. Connect with us. I'd love to hear from you. Hear what ails you in the realm of digital marketing. Are there courses you need, information that you'd like to hear, or maybe some past guests that you'd like to hear more from? Thanks again for being a listener of the Endless Coffee Cup, and I look forward to hearing from you. Yeah, I look at it very similarly to the filibuster issue. Depending upon who's in charge in Congress, we need it. No, it's terrible. We should do away with it. We need it. And one party integrates it, and then the next party uses it. And it comes down to, exactly, who are you going to manage, or who's going to manage this? Because they can't even agree. When they're not in power, this is an important tool. When they are in power, this is not an important tool. We don't need it. So great example, great example. And I think to your point, with social media, we have not had to be challenged in large part with opinions. You can turn it off, you can walk away, you can, not follow people, you can block people. And so the ability to maybe articulate a position, even you don't want to hear anyone else's, but you've also never been challenged to articulate what you truly believe or understand about something in a situation where you just can't turn that person off. And so that lack of face to face, where you're trapped with someone and you have to talk with them, I think that has contributed to it as well.
I think that, yeah, that's a great point. And I often get questions from folks about like, how do I talk to people I disagree with? I always say one of the best things to ask people is to defend their viewpoint rather than attack it. Just say like, oh, I had never heard that. What evidence do you have to support that? And
Hmm.
you can plant a seed that, you don't have that evidence. And also I think bringing up like different interpretations is also very important. So I was speaking a moment ago about, sort of the demand to censor racist content. Sometimes I'm astounded at how one thing is interpreted as racist and something that I think is racist is not. And I think a prime example of that is like the origin of COVID. A lot of social media sites suppressed the lab leak theory,
Right.
arguing that it was racist. But the official narrative was essentially that, and Glenn Greenwald's talked about this, that Chinese people eat weird meats in unsanitary markets, and that's why they get viruses. And I'm like,
Right.
that's really racist.
That's much
Say,
more racist.
yeah,
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, a lab leak implies that there's smart people doing things.
yeah,
So
exactly.
that's yeah, that's exactly one of the same stories I sort of followed with because it was trying to replace a narrative with a worse one and justifying it that way. And yeah, it's hilarious when you just sit down and think about it and not sure who came up with that talking point. But to your point, even asking someone why? Why do you feel that way? Or why are you passionate about this? Rather than, as you said, attacking, learning. What is it? And usually you'll find that there is that's one thing I love about when you can get to we all kind of want the same things. It's just that
Yeah.
we're interpreting how to get there differently. And so when you kind of get someone's story, I think there's more empathy that, now I understand why you're coming from that standpoint or why you're so strongly that way. I think, yeah, listening has just been a lost art in our modern culture.
Absolutely. And I want to pick up on something else you said there, I think is really important, which is that, and you said this also in the face-to-face side of things, that human element, that connection is critically important. I think a lot of, I guess, more right-leaning folks online felt comfortable, for example, to talk about how something like the Sandy Hook shooting didn't happen and the parents' kids didn't exist and they were all actors. I can't imagine you doing that to the face of one of these people who lost their child in that tragedy. It's really
Right.
easy to do through a screen, and it's kind of whatever. It's a fun little conspiracy narrative we can weave and explain and find videos and pictures out of context. But to actually look one of those people in the eye, someone who's lost a child in that tragedy, I mean, maybe there's a handful of people. I just don't think the majority of people who engaged in that nonsense would actually do that to their face. And I think it's a prime example of what you're speaking to. When you recognize the humanity in someone, you can't treat them like that. You're forced to respect their humanity if you have any, dignity in who you are as a person or integrity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's part of even the media literacy that they've been bringing into schools is would you say this to someone to their face? When you see some comments that have been made, and we dealt with this, even on the marketing side when we would get a negative review and I would work with the company that of course they wanted to just respond and just lay into this person, whatever. And my first advice to them was pick up the phone.
Mhm.
Pick up the phone and call them. And I would say the majority of the time, 9 out of 10 times, the person would simply say, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to be so mean. I just didn't think anyone heard me, or I didn't think it would go anywhere." And so when it was then not even a face to face, it was just a verbal phone call, immediately they would back off. And change what they had said, and it would soften. So much of that, yeah, behind a screen, it's easy to be angry. And face to face, it's a much different story.
Yeah, we have a version of that in the education sector as well. I think students sometimes mistake like email communication for social media. But once you ask them, like, okay, I think we should talk about this, either, whatever, even on Zoom or in person, their tone totally changes. They have a much more softer tone, and they're more focused on the issue at hand versus the attacks, and their tone, is much more inviting. So I think that's a great piece of advice for all sectors of our community and country. Try to get that, real time synchronous communication. That I think could absolve a lot of people of some of these behaviorisms that are, like, shall we say, less than desirable.
Well, it's funny. I was just reading an article the other day they said whenever they get an email that requires more than 5 minutes to read or process or anything like that, they immediately reply with, "Can you give me a call?" and take it to a phone call. And they said immediately it shortens, but most people get nervous because they actually have to talk. And it just helps with that processing, that rather than just dealing with it in text, let's hear each other. And so
Mhm.
you get more than nonverbal, you get the emphasis, you get the tone. And they said it's really been helping their day by moving things more to a phone instead of constantly the back and forth on email. So to your point, yeah, that more of that communication interface widening open.
Yeah, I don't know how you feel about him. I've been a big fan of his, but I don't know if you've read any of Cal Newport's books. But Cal Newport, he wrote many great books. But one of his arguments is about, and I love this, how we used to email around work, and now we work around email. And I was like, that's, so a solution like you're describing there, I could see that being very advantageous for, especially for companies trying to make money where time is money.
Brilliant. I like that because that's exactly what has happened. And, that's one of the things I was talking about someone the other day, and I told him, yeah, in France, you can't email after 5 p.m. You can't email on the weekend. I says, probably one of the nice French things that I would absolutely integrate into our culture. People make jokes all the time, but I think we need that. Absolutely. Well, one of the things I wanted to ask you about is, and this was in your Substack the other day and kind of moving where we're going, but that I did not realize that media literacy was picked up so quickly in Europe as the digital age, as we entered that. And the US lagged behind in digital and media literacy. How did that happen? How did Europe get such a head start on that? And I guess we're kind of seeing the effects of it as being behind when usually we think we're in front of the world when it comes to tech.
Yeah, absolutely. The U.S. has always played with the idea of adding media literacy. Its first major kind of push was actually during World War II, prior to the U.S. entering the. But the media literacy of the time, which was run by the IPA, not the bear, they were called the IPA. I think Columbia University is where they were housed, but they were basically trying to spot fallacies, like basic critical thinking stuff. They were worried about the fascist propaganda from Italy and Germany and elsewhere. But by the time the US entered the war in 1941, we saw a problem that consistently happens with media literacy in this country, which is the government wants you to be media literacy about propaganda internationally, but they do not want you to be media literate about their propaganda. So there was a lot of pressure put on the IPA, and it eventually closed as a result. But from there, in the 60s and 70s, due to the art movement, there was media literacy about putting art in schools.
Hmm.
So let's teach students how to be art and understand art. And that was somewhat successful. But then, in the 80s, you start to get television in the home, and people are spending more and more time on their screen, less time reading. This is where media critics like Neil Postman said, we're amusing ourselves to death.
Love that.
And that fear, picked up in Europe. You have many scholars, particularly I'll point out David Buckingham, who's a great scholar, and they were putting together media literacy curriculum, and it was adopted by the state. And in Europe, especially starting in the 1990s, media literacy is a part of schools. There's, critiques to make about the level of media literacy, but there was something there at least. They took it seriously, and it created a foundation where when new technologies emerged, like cable and eventually the internet and then smart devices, they already had a foundation for adding that to schools. But that's where the story diverges. In the US,
Mm.
we were still trying to define media literacy by the early 1990s. A US definition was highly influenced by the work of Buckingham. But one of the problems that those advocates of media literacy ran into here in the 90s was twofold. One, there's a traditionalist belief in education that says, like, don't have students watching films or sharing their feelings through art, have them reading Shakespeare and, knowing the classics and all that. So there was kind of this elitist sense amongst educators that it would water down education to bring that stuff in the classroom.
Hmm.
But the other thing, which I think is more important, and this one we're still not semi, we are struggling with. America has a decentralized education system. Local school boards have so much influence over your school, way more than the federal government in a lot of respects, and state governments. And that's a good thing, I think, at some level. But it can obviously be a bad thing with these don't say gay bills and things like that. But point being, to get media, you don't have an education czar who can put media literacy in all U.S. schools. You have to go
Right.
by district, and then debates will ensue about what type of media literacy you're teaching. Then there's also, and this comes from my dear colleague, Allison Butler, you also have to train teachers to teach media literacy. So even if you get it in schools, who's going to teach it? And all those problems have really made the U.S. struggle. Also, the U.S. has, since the 80s gone through a lot of austerity measures. So they're cutting budgets.
Yeah.
And what happens is companies say, like, okay, you don't have money for education. That's all right. We'll come in. Pepsi says, let us put Pepsi machines all throughout the school. Don't let Coca-Cola in, and we'll buy you a new video board for your gym. Mac says, okay, take all our MacBooks. You can use them in the classroom. So corporate media literacy starts to dominate the little media literacy that's offered in the United States. The story finally shifts in 2015, 2016. There is a fear about fake news, what I call a moral panic over it. And a lot of people start to take media literacy seriously. And state by state, it depends. But you've got states like California that kind of have empty rhetoric about media literacy, but at least rhetoric, that's better than most of it. But then you have like school districts like Los Angeles, thanks to the work of folks like Jeff Scher, who's a friend of mine and collaborator, who got it in LA Unified School District. There's some work in Massachusetts and things like that. So America is kind of where Europe was in the late 80s in terms of getting media literacy into schools, but that's how we got passed up. And I think you see a lot of well-meaning educators and parents and school administrators struggling right now because they have a narrative about what these tools are. Like, smartphones are bad for education, but you've got 20, 25 years of students who are raised on just the opposite, and so they're trying to negotiate that in these spaces.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's a very interesting debate. I find myself really kind of square in the middle of it, with teenagers, with a teenager in high school, in college, and debating, the smartphones in schools, and going through that with my school administrators. Like, what's our policy? I think Ohio is going to ban them in the next 2 years, but now it's up to every school district what they want to do. So, and I have to stress that the parental involvement is, you cannot just assume the school is going to take care of your kid. You've got to know who's on the school board, what they're doing, what are their plans, what are their philosophies of education. I do enjoy seeing people active. I don't enjoy seeing all the videos that hit the the internet about these school board meetings. To me, at least, I'm like, someone's interested. That right now, that's where we need to be, is just get interested in what's going on.
Yeah, and I to your point about parents, this is Allison Butler and I just released a book, Surveillance Education, on surveillance in schools. And one of the things I found like most fascinating is we looked at some of these schools who had done bans on phones, or like they have a cubby you have to lock your phone in during the school day.
Mm-hmm.
And my assumption, I'm not a parent, so maybe that's why I have this assumption. My assumption was that the students were the ones that were going to freak out, and you were going to end up with a mutiny in the classroom. But actually, the data said the opposite. Students found it more enriching, learning, connecting. They liked it. It was the parents who were irate and said, no, I want to be able to contact my child whenever. What if there's a tragedy like a school shooting? I want my student to have their phone on. And so it was actually the parents who pushed back, not the students in a lot of ways.
Absolutely. That is what most of the data is showing. And even one of my daughters is starting college this fall. And the provost was telling us that they had one girl, first few weeks of school, her mother texted her over 100 times. And eventually this girl dropped out because of the anxiety of I have to answer my mom all the time. She just couldn't deal with that. The mother couldn't deal with the separation. The daughter tried to put the phone away, but then she goes 3 hours without responding, and it was the mother that was upset. So yeah, there's it's beyond the kids. There's, they're the ones that grown up with it all their life, but also their parents have grown up with it all that child's life. And there's a method of parenting that has been implemented here that is not the healthiest.
Yeah, I would concur, and I think these tools make it, way too easy. Like people share their location with their friends and their parents, and they can be tracked constantly. And to me, it's like really 1984. I don't know. When I was in high school, I was, always trying to avoid my parents or things like that. Like, but it's weird. It's very strange for someone, I guess, for my generation to see this becoming so normalized.
Hmm. Oh, absolutely. I had a friend of mine, we grew up in the 80s, and we would laugh that our parents had no idea where we were, what we were doing. And if you didn't meet your friends at the appointed time, you're done.
Sorry, yeah, you're done.
There was no way you were going to catch up because we don't know where you are. You didn't show up. So it was, very different time, but yet how quickly it has transformed. But related to that, so you're in the education system, and I know there's I've even had some shows about this where, if you're going to be working in marketing, you've got to be looking at certifications. You've got to be doing that. And I'm not an advocate that a certification supersedes a degree, that there's still some education necessary. But what I'm looking at is when kids are coming out, what are they prepared for? What are they ready to do? And you're right in the middle of it. You're teaching media. I'd love to think that you're preparing journalists, the next generation of journalism. How are you approaching this, and what are you seeing in your experience?
Yeah, I think there's always been a tension within higher ed, and I think it's really ramped up in the last couple of years, or last couple decades, I should say, as faculty have been really emaciated in higher ed. So 30 years ago, three-fourths of faculty were tenure track faculty. Now it's about a fourth to a third. The majority of faculty are so-called at-will, adjunct lecturers, little security, they get paid less benefits. And as a result, they have to work on multiple campuses to make a living, which means they're much more exhausted, spend less time with their students, and also just know less about the institution, which means they have less of that participating governance. A lot more of the power has been ceded to administrators, and volumes of data on administrative bloat. And you'll hear faculty. I'm a faculty member, I should say that, very biased in this administrative bloat. But at the heart of your question, higher ed, at least public education, is supposed to be a public good. And it was kind of doing two things. One, prepare the populace to participate in a democracy. So have an informed citizenry that can, participate and strengthen our democracy, but also prepare them for survival in the world, whatever it may be. And I think particularly that's like vocational training and things like that, right? Also financial literacy, the things you need to live in a capitalist society, right? And despite many of my Marxist brothers and sisters in the academy, we live in a capitalist society. So let's accept the reality of where we live. And so the tension, though, I think comes because since the 70s and 80s, we've treated the public sector more and more like private industry. And the public sector is just not good at being a private industry, point blank. But they treat it like higher ed needs constant growth, and it needs to be turning profits, and we need to invest tuition dollars. And so to do that, we've relied more and more on advertising to students, feel good activities. You're going to get an experience. You're going to get to talk to people in industry. Oh, great stuff. But is it worth being in, $100,000, $200,000 debt for the rest of your life? And a lot of us who care deeply about education have warned, like, you're setting these students up for failure in a lot of ways. They end up getting more and more extracurriculars that don't apply directly to that serving that public good, or oftentimes their job, and they don't have enough time to put into their schoolwork. At the same time, because they treat it like a data-driven industry, they measure success by passing grades and degree attainment. Well, if anybody knows anything about basic economics, if you incentivize degree attainment and higher grades as a sign of success, don't be surprised if you see grade inflation, which begs another question. Are these students actually learning, or are they just getting a piece of paper? And then what happens? If they
Yeah.
do use that paper to get a job, are they able to even keep that job? Have they learned any of those skills? And so I think these are some of the issues that people have started to speak about in the last 4 or 5 years during COVID in particular. Those folks who did go through the college process, who did buy Bill Clinton's adage, you have to learn so you can earn. A lot of those folks came out saying like, I don't know, I think I could have got this job without the degree, or I think I had the skills to succeed without the degree, which I think is fine. I think college should be available for everyone, but I don't think it's for everyone, to be quite frank. And so you start to see more and more people, I think, push back about the value of education. Simultaneously, a lot of industries got rid of the BA as a entry point and said like, no, we don't need someone with a bachelor's to do job X, or we can train them for cheaper on site to do this job.
Right.
So I think all those factors are really hurting higher ed. There's much lower enrollment. I, again, personally blame the management of higher ed over the last 40 or 50 years. I think they turned us into a caricature of ourselves in a lot of ways to be on campus. If you're a faculty member in the classroom, you still have a lot of power to give a deep and meaningful education. And that's something that drives me. It's something I appreciate that I'm able to do in the classroom. But increasingly, the pressure is on teachers to do just the opposite. It's a lot of feel-good community building, build relationships, not that kind of deep intellectual push that I think we used to value.
Mm. Well, yeah, because the classroom, I look at higher ed classroom, the whole purpose of that is to be challenged. It's to develop those critical thinking skills, to develop more of that introspective why. Why do I believe this? What is driving me? Those types of things. And I can certainly see, it's the commoditization of education, just like so many other industries, it becomes run by the financials rather than the purpose. We're seeing, like Boeing's a great example. It became ran by the financials rather than by the engineers. And we see that in education where it gets run by the administration with the financial bottom line. And to your point, when that's the goal, then the mission suffers.
Yeah, I think, and because what you do is you reclassify students as customers.
Yeah.
And anybody who knows anything about business knows the customer is always right. And so I think they've a lot of the smoke they blow up the behind of students, I think gives students a warped view of what higher ed is. So they have things now like bias reporting in a lot of campuses where students are expected to report bias in the classroom. And no offense to students, but I'm just like, what training do you have to be able to detect bias? Or they increasingly rely on student evaluations as a way to get information in the classroom. No offense to students, but like, what information do you know about being a professional teacher? It'd be like me going to my doctor and them evaluating, his surgery procedure. Like, I don't know, man, but it looks good to me. Like, what do I know? So I think a lot of that has created a barrier between teachers and students. Students think they're there to evaluate the teachers. Teachers are there to serve the customer or the students in a lot of ways. And administration has created unique ways, I think, of weeding out people who challenge this dynamic. And one of the things I always point to, and this is where, as a white guy on the surface, I get into some trouble, but hopefully if people listen long enough, they'll understand. I think the diversity statement has been actually a homogeneity statement. It's very Orwellian how they call it a diversity statement, because their definition of diversity is a very narrow, data-driven, neoliberal understanding of how diversity matters. Christian Parenti calls it a diversity ideology. He says he's for diversity. Let's diversify everything.
Right.
Let's get more people, more voices, more perspectives, more backgrounds, more regions. But what they have is a diversity, ideology that if you racially, gender, and sexually diversify the leadership of a campus, the gains of people who share that identity will trickle down to them. It's basically trickle-down economics for identity. Just like trickle-down economics, I think it's nonsense. But if you're someone who challenges that, it says like, no, what about like actual diversity initiatives? Like, why not, not all people of color are like milquetoast Democrat neoliberals. There are Republican conservatives, there are far-right radicals, there are anarchists. Like, let's diversify what it means to be a person of color. There's no interest in that because those groups will actually challenge the institution. So they just want, their neoliberal diversity, and that's it. And so that statement ends up being, I think, really problematic because, and Noam Chomsky wrote about this 25 years ago.
Mm.
He said the whole application process through higher ed is a way to weed out people who are going to be a problem for higher ed. In school, whether you're going to grad school or whether you're going for a job, they look at that app and try and find things. So like, oh, this guy's going to be a problem. He's going to call us out on our BS. We want a yes man. Let's do this. And I think the students are the ones who suffer. I think it would be great for a student to get these radical different views, to argue with the instructor about these different views so they could challenge themselves and challenge the instructor, and the whole community would benefit. But instead, a lot of educators have become comfortable treating the classroom like a rally.
Yeah,
like, let me say what's popular and get some cheers.
I mean, you're making me remember my own college experience, and I know specifically I had two professors where I differed radically with their ideology. But being the intelligent 19-year-old that I was very assured of what I believed. And, anyone that 18 to 24-year-old, they know, and they be assured they're experts in what they know. But I look at, and through that college experience, for me, I got humbled a couple of times. But that humbling was so valuable, because it prepared me for getting into life. It prepared me for, I may not be right about everything, but those events are still so memorable because they impacted my thinking process, my view of self, and also the value of others. And so it's so hard to hear what you're saying, because to me, that's what that college experience. Yes, it was stuff I've learned, but it was also learning to be open to others' views, not be such an idiot about what I believed, and get some of those humbling experiences where you realize I'm not as smart as I thought I was.
Yeah, and I completely agree. I can think of multiple times where I spoke up as the know-it-all and just got decimated by evidence. And it prepared me for life to say, like, yeah, don't speak on things you don't know, or
Yeah.
make sure you make it very clear, I don't know. Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. But, like I said, today with the bias reporting and student evaluations, it can be detrimental to your career to put students on blast like that or challenge them. You might be accused of bias, or contributing negatively to their mental health or whatever. And so I want to be very clear that I don't blame a lot of faculty. These are folks who have bills to pay. They've got children of their own. They kind of just move along to get along to collect the paycheck. But I think in the long run, that's really bad for the students, really bad for the country, and really bad for the institution when we normalize that.
Yeah, absolutely. So what great stories have you seen? Maybe some of your students or examples coming through, people studying journalism, media. What are some of the positives and good stories you've seen?
Yeah, great question. That's really asked. This is one of the being a critic of higher ed and teaching higher ed is a difficult place for me to be in, because when I walk onto any campus, the first thing I think of is all the problems with the campus. But once you get in the classroom and you get with those students, that all just disappears. You don't care. The young people today they're incredible. They're hungry. They're hungry for information. They're online all the time reading things. So they'll say things like, "Is this true? Have you heard of this?" And I'm like, "I don't know who this person is. Let's put them up on the screen. Let's talk about them." And they have a very interesting worldview, and where I think a lot of, at least when I was in college, I remember a lot of discussions about what was wrong with the world, which was important, but there wasn't a lot of solutions discussion.
Yeah.
At least in my estimation, the students over the last 5-6 years, they're hungry for solutions. They want to know, what can I do? And so in like journalism courses, I teach them the, age-old journalistic techniques of sources and how to write a journalism article and vet sources and multiple views and editors. But we also talk about, like, look, we know most of you are not, probably none of you are picking up a newspaper. So how do you get your news? And they talk about social media posts or podcasts or videos. And so we say, okay, let's take this journalism and let's turn it into those formats. And they thrive on that stuff. They love it. And I have them I try and keep them local. for two reasons. One, I think learning how to report on a local community is critically important. Don't go for the slam dunk Trump or Biden pieces. Like, find local. But also, there's news deserts all throughout this country. So I like to train these universities and colleges to report locally, so the local community has some idea of what's going on in their community.
Right.
And I have been just thoroughly impressed by these students who are really, really bold. I had one, there was a rumor of a sex cult in the community, and I was stunned. These students were very bold in going up to these individuals and people who left it and asking hard-hitting questions. And even though they probably had their own bias, they edited it in a really objective way where they let the multiple sides be heard in this. And so those type of stories are what keep me going. And I think particularly through the Gaza protests, youth are always ragged on, right? Youth get blamed for everything.
Yeah.
Youth blame old people like me for everything. But during the Gaza protests, there was this weird narrative that came out on right and liberal media that what we're doing in higher ed is, training everyone to love Hamas and be an anti-Semite and, all this stuff. But what I actually found by talking to these students is a multitude of diversity of perspectives on what was going on.
Right.
Some, yes, were pro-Hamas. Some were just pro-Palestine. Some were pro-peace. Some were anti-genocide. Some were Jews who were opposed to what Israel was doing, but also really opposed to a lot of what they saw as anti-Semitic rhetoric around these issues.
Yeah.
And I think that rich diversity speaks to what this generation could offer us. But we have these narratives that I think just pigeonhole these folks incorrectly, and we miss an opportunity to tap into the value of what these young people are showing us.
I love it. That is so hopeful, for the future and to hear, especially focusing on that local aspect there are stories right here that you can build, and it's valuable for people to learn what's going on around them. I think you've said this before, that the majority of policies that you live under are at the state and local level rather than the national level, but yet that gets 99% of the attention, and locally, there's not a lot of information about what's happening. So that's such a critical, and I love to hear that you are so positive and upbeat about that.
Yeah, the local politics have so much more influence over your life. I mean, things seemingly meaningless, like a local land deal or something, it could have huge implications for the entire community. If that land is commercial or if it's private, if it's condos, if it's homes, whatever, it could just affect your property values. It could affect who lives in the community, who's coming into the community. And it seems like kind of a banal topic. Who the hell wants to talk about land values and, your tiny town, wherever you may live? But it really is important. It can play huge levels. And my God, local corruption, you could get a whole career out of local corruption and pay you. So I think there's a lot of meat on the bone there for folks to dig into if we had the infrastructure. And I'm happy that colleges and universities largely allow me and the students to do that work.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Well, one of the things I wanted to leave with is you're on Substack, and I'm going to put a link to that in the show notes. But Substack seems to be, just to talk about Substack for a while, I've seen so many professional journalists move to Substack and have been absolutely amazed at what it's done for them. Even some who have relied on Twitter for the past, 10 to 15 years. I read one, he completely left Twitter, and his Substack seems to be growing even faster without Twitter. I'm still calling it Twitter, X, formerly Twitter.
Deal on Matt.
and I guess he'll sue you now if you don't use it. So what's that experience been like, moving to Substack and starting to develop your readership there?
It's actually been amazingly positive, and I had a similar experience to the one you just described. I sort of just, I was writing these op-eds, and I publish them in multiple places, like, Salon this week, San Francisco Chronicle that week, USA Today this week. And I kept having people say, like, oh, can you send me that when it's published? And I was like, maybe I'll start a Substack. People can sign up, and then that way I'll just send everything to that Substack, and people want to read it. It's free, whatever, just take it. I was not prepared for how many people I don't even know who somehow came across my Substack and signed up. There was, I guess, a real hunger for this intersection of media history and education that I'm privileged to write about. And so I have a positive experience, but I do want to actually flip the interview on you for a second, because there's something this is way more in your wheelhouse than mine. But I started to get the impression So for folks who don't know, I have social media accounts, but I rarely use them. And basically they're there in case somebody goes to, say, Facebook and wants to find me, they can look me up to find my email to email me. But I started to get the impression that social media was not the lucrative, connective venture that it might have been like 10 years ago. Small things I saw, like Elon charging you for the blue check on X or Twitter. The Facebook, I think one time cut down so you could only connect like 100 friends at once or something
Mm-hmm.
like that. But anyways, long story short, I started to get the impression that I wasn't getting the attention on social media that I was getting a decade earlier. And I talked to other professionals who had drawn the same conclusion. And that drove a lot of us to Substack. But you're more into the analytics of that. Is that just kind of anecdotal? You guys don't know how to use the tools properly, or is that something you're seeing across the industry?
No, so this is what you're seeing as a result of the quest for monetization. Any social media platform is going to limit the exposure of any content that has an external link. They just don't want you to leave,
Mhm.
because if you leave, you don't see ads. And so, any of them that, for example, like for Instagram, you can't put an external link except in your
Mm.
bio. And you can say, go to my bio. That rarely happens. But, LinkedIn, Facebook, anything like that, they are going to severely limit. And then we've also seen changes in the algorithm. You're not seeing the people you want to follow near as much as you are seeing what they want you to see.
Mhm.
You're seeing what the algorithm is the rich get richer is basically what it is. It's I can't remember the specific name of it. That's one thing that Douglas Rushkoff talks a lot about, is just the algorithm is there to make popular people more popular, because that brings in more money and it brings in more revenue. So if it can't be monetized, they don't want to do it. So the algorithms have changed specifically to focus much, much more on that monetization, rather than let's get good voices, let's get good content. They can't define good. They just know what's popular.
Okay, yeah, interesting. See, I had the same experience, and something I've been sort of researching as a result is how those changes have affected internet culture.
Mm.
Because the internet, at least in my estimation, the social media culture, say of like, I don't know, 2010, is so much different
Oh,
than the media culture of 2024. And the algorithm plays such a critical role in that. I feel there's like less of that, what seemed like more authentic communication connection now versus then.
oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Once surveillance technology, surveillance capitalism took over, it transformed social media. Y- You know, it- I look at I call it the 2012 apocalypse.
Mhm.
Prior to 2012, yeah, it was completely different. But then as soon as people realize I have a voice and I am important and I can put a picture of myself in, and all of a sudden the narrative shifts to it's me at the
Mhm.
center. Prior to having a camera, having social apps and unlimited data, it was still more community focused. And you still had a few people that would arise in, some YouTube, things like that. But with the entrance of all of this information, it just made it much more me focused, and look at all my likes and look at all this, and not realizing it's the algorithm kind of pushing that because, well, it's driving ad views. So if we can keep you on for another 40 seconds, that's another ad view. And that's how we're going to do it.
That's an interesting big to 2012 too. I mean, that's coming after Occupy and the Arab Spring, and I think that's right around the time when all those in power realized, like, oh, they can actually use these things against us and crack
Well,
this down.
yeah, that's why I tell people the Mayans were right. It's it's the confluence of unlimited data, a native app on the iPhone. Facebook started with an original app and it was terrible, but the new app allowed integration with the phone and also messaging, and then also you had, trying to think what was the thing of it was. But basically what happened is, prior to that, and from a commercial standpoint, I used to talk about how people would go on vacation, they would do something, they would take pictures. Then when they would get home, they would make a review. they would
Mhm.
upload their pictures. Well, now I've got a native camera and a social site in my phone with data wherever I'm at. I'm now giving the review after I check in. I'm now taking pictures and uploading while I'm there. So it's transformed it into a more immediate process. Prior to that, there was separation and you could think about it and you could prepare. Now it's people can post without thinking.
I know one of my favorite examples of that is whenever you look like a Yelp review for like a bar, when someone is drunkenly writing their review while they're at the bar.
Yeah.
Stupid bartender won't serve me.
Yeah. They're sending me out, kicking me out. Yeah. But yeah, to me, that's why I'm enjoying Substack is there's no algorithm. And to me, I love it because journalists are becoming rewarded for their work, for their writing. There's probably 4 or 5 people I just follow so closely because once you find a good writer with good ideas, you kind of wonder what it's like finding a great steak after eating McDonald's for 30 years. It's like I didn't know food could be this good, and that's the way I feel about finding some great writers that I knew journalism could be good, but now I'm finding some good ones, and so it's not affected yet by algorithms and monetization. So I feel like that's sort of the cycle of social media is eventually it may happen, but right now I'm enjoying it.
Yeah, no, I agree. And with the Substack too, back to our conversation about news deserts, I've noticed how many people have just started Substack talking about their local community because no news outlet will. And so some of them just, they'll only cover city council meetings, or others will just post like pictures of like accidents or something that someone sent them. But it's I think at least getting us turning in a better direction than where we were heading. So I don't want to, totally be a advertiser here for Substack, but at least in my experiences like yours, have been very positive, and I like what I'm seeing thus far. But I think you're also right to caution that we've been here before. All the optimism and promise of a new platform.
Exactly. Yeah, I part of me, and yeah, we're towards the end here. I'll let you know my opinion of TikTok. Yeah, I understand it's a free speech issue, but part of me just wants TikTok shut down. And I agree. It's made us dumber. I honestly believe this has been the one social media that has just lowered the bar substantially, and we've seen results of that. So just on that principle alone, like, but yes, I do having the government just shut something down because it doesn't like it. You're treading on some pretty dangerous ground.
Absolutely. And I thought what I always found interesting though about the TikTok shutdown is basically all the arguments except the foreign ownership you could make about any other social media platform.
Exactly.
So by that logic, shut them all down if you're going to go that route, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Not advocating for the government to have that control, but I'm just saying by that logic, right? Like that's
well, it's the old joke. The government doesn't like competition, so.
So true.
Well, Nolan, this has just been a great conversation. Always enjoy having you on the show. Always enjoy our conversations. Thank you so much for coming online.
Oh gosh, Matt, it's always a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much. And thank you to the audience for listening. Hope to talk to you all soon.
Absolutely. And Nolan, yeah, so I mentioned your Substack. I'm going to put a couple of links here, but if people want to read anything you've done or follow you online, where would be a good place for that?
It's my name, nolanhigdon.substack.com. So NOLANHIG as in good, D as in David ON.substack.com. And it's totally free. I know some other media folks say that's free and then they charge you. I mean, free. I mean, everything is absolutely free. There's not a charge for anything that I produce. It's interviews, videos, guest writers, my stuff, and hope that everyone will sign up.
Very cool, Nolan. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
And dear listener, thank you for attending another episode of the Endless Coffee Cup. I finished my coffee very early on this one. I should have had 2 cups, but I look forward to our next coffee and conversation on the Endless Coffee Cup podcast. You've been listening to the Endless Coffee Cup. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with somebody else. And of course, please take just a moment and rate or review us at your favorite podcast service. If you need more information, contact me at sitelogicmarketing.com. Thanks again for being such a great listener.